Hey, I'm Felissa Rose, and you're watching Keto and Crime.
San Francisco residents on shore get a long-distance view of one of the most spectacular prison revolts ever attempted, as Alcatraz guards are overcome by such vicious criminals as Bernard Paul Coy with a lengthy prison record, Joseph Paul Kretzer facing a life term as a cold-blooded killer, and Marvin Franklin Hubbard, kidnapper. Coy and his crew of desperados fought furiously with guards and Marines. Fought in their attempted escape by the heroism of a guard who refused to surrender the main key, the barricaded convicts carried on a pitched battle which raged for 2 days and nights.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Keto and Crime and Thought Crime. Today I've got a real interesting one for you. We're going to have a first of a two-parter on Alcatraz, the Rock, the famous federal prison in San Francisco Bay. More importantly, we're going to look at 2 of the 14 attempted escapes from the Rock. These were both way up and well over 50 years ago, so I've done a lot of research. These were very interesting, and I think you're going to enjoy it. But before we jump into the first of those escape attempts, let's get into the history of the Rock itself, shall we? Alcatraz Federal Prison started in the 1850s as a fortress to defend San Francisco Bay from foreign powers. However, after a while, they determined that that really wasn't needed because no one was coming for us, at least not at that time. And then in 1868, they decided it would serve better to contain foreign and federal prisoners. The prisoners that were A, very dangerous, or B, had had a problem in the federal prison system because of attempted escapes or other things. Anyway, they decided because of its proximity to San Francisco, with a large Marine garrison there, as well as a Coast Guard headquarters there, that it would be an excellent place to put federal prisoners, especially with the freezing cold waves of the Pacific separating Alcatraz Island from the mainland, that it would be almost escape-proof. In fact, they said it was escape-proof. And who better to build it, to tear down the existing barracks and build it into a new federal prison than the federal prisoners themselves? So you had people arrested during the American Civil War. You had other prisoners that started construction on the new prison. At first, it was a military prison. Then, by 1909, it had been rebuilt into a shiny new federal prison for all federal prisoners, and it was opened as a federal prison officially in 1934 with the swearing-in ceremony. And it held its share. Not only did it hold ranking military prisoners, but think of Machine Gun Kelly, Al Capone, all prisoners at Alcatraz, because they were very dangerous and they needed to be kept in what authorities thought was an escape-proof prison. Also at Alcatraz, they maintained their military roots by maintaining what they called Alcatraz Industries. Now, Alcatraz wasn't just a prison, it was an industrial complex. They had machine shops, textile mills, all kinds of things there where they made necessary things for the U.S. military. They did laundry for the Marine Corps there. They did shoes. They built furniture, all this stuff for Marine and Naval Coast Guard barracks. So the federal government was making a pretty penny on this because you could pay these prisoners just a few cents a day to work. First of all, the prisoners wanted to work, because who wants to sit in a cell staring at the wall all day? They were earning a tad bit of money, which would go on an account, and if they ever got released, They would receive a check for that amount that might help get them at least off the island in a hotel for a couple of weeks. And, of course, they saved a whole lot of money because instead of paying American workers in normal factories or defense contractors hundreds of thousands of dollars to manufacture this stuff, they were literally just paying for the cost of supplies and what would equate to third world labor wages. Now, the prison itself was divided into 4 prison blocks: A, B, C, D. Each one of these had a main drag that went down. They were called different city names, which I will show you here in a moment. And they each had a utility corridor behind each row of cells. So you had a lower level of cells, then you had a catwalk with another level of cells. And in between each of these cell houses, you had a utility corridor where repairs could be made, and that will be very much important in both of the escape attempts we're going to talk about. Now, D block. Let's talk about D block. A, B, and C was your normal general population prisoners where they had a routine. They would be woken up by 5:30 in the morning. By 6 o'clock, they would be marched, general population would be marched to chow, where they would go in and sit at very long picnic tables where the guards could watch them. After that, those that had jobs would file out for their sections and be kind of scrubbed down, hosed down, patted down to get to their places of work, and there they would work for 8 to 9 hours a day, breaking for lunch in the mess hall, and then they would be sent back to their cells and be marched to dinner about 4:30 in the afternoon, and then back to their cells for mostly quiet time. Now we'll talk about that as well. Now, D block. D block was for people that were in solitary confinement. And there were a lot of people at Alcatraz, because of their danger level, were in solitary confinement where they didn't leave their cell at all. So in this, you had the Birdman of Alcatraz, you had Al Capone, you had some of the people we're about to talk about in these escape attempts that lived by themselves. Also, D block held what they called the hole. These were 4 cells where people that caused trouble in general population could be thrown into as a punishment for 4 days. They were light-proof, soundproof, and literally it was torturous hell to be put into what they called the hole or the dungeon. The corrections officers at Alcatraz were the best of the best. Most of them had military training, had been state police, city police, and Alcatraz had a routine that was honestly never disturbed. But it also was unique in that at most prisons, most of the time prisoners don't want to work because they have other things to do. At Alcatraz, most of the prisoners wanted to work, and it was considered a privilege. So they had people vying for every job that was available. So they kind of had a moneymaker there when it comes to industry. Also, because of its proximity to San Francisco and its location off the dock, you had the warden, the associate warden, and many of the guards living with their families on the island. You had housing there, so you did have a civilian population, and because of that, you had a supply boat that came from San Francisco Bay, from the Horseshoe Cut in the river near the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge. You had a boat that would come out with supplies docking every day between 2 and 2:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And that's going to be huge for the escape attempt we're about to talk about. So let's talk about it, shall we? The first escape attempt we're going to talk about is known as the Battle of Alcatraz. It actually happened from May 2nd to May 4th, 1946, and it was literally an attempt by prisoners to shoot their way out, but it turned into just a shoot-'em-up battle between guards, Marines, Coast Guard, and the prisoners. Let's talk about it. During this escape attempt, 2 guards, William Miller and Harold Stites, were killed in action. You had 14 other guards wounded. You had 3 of the 6 prisoners involved killed during the attempt, and the other 3 were sent to trial. We'll talk about what happened there. But before we get into the actual battle, let's talk about the prisoners involved in it, shall we? First, we have who we'll call the mastermind, Bernard Coy. Bernard was a bank robber that took to bank robbing from necessity in Kentucky during the Great Depression. He was born February 13th, 1900, New Haven, Kentucky. During one bank robbery, he was caught. He was sent to a federal prison in Atlanta and attempted an escape, which led them to imprison him for the remainder of his sentence, plus a few extra tacked on for the escape attempt in Alcatraz. Now, Coy was in a unique position because he had earned the right to be what they called the orderly of the cell house for C and D. So basically, he was the janitor for C block, which was the general population block, and D block, which was the solitary confinement wing. And because of that, he did all the general cleaning, and so he was out of his cell 8 to 9 hours a day, sweeping down Broadway, which was the strip that ran down C block, and he also did all the general cleaning, such as washing the walls, sweeping the catwalks, all that stuff. So he got to know the guards, also got to know their routine, and he was definitely the mastermind of this breakout attempt. His partner in crime was Joseph Kretzer. He was born April 17th, 1911, somewhere in Montana. We don't know a whole lot about his background, but we do know that he was a founding member of the Kretzer-Kyle gang, which was a huge mafia gang out west during the Depression era. They ran brothels and speakeasies in California. He ran it with his brother-in-law, Arnold Kyle, whom he was married to Arnold's sister, Edna, who was also part of the gang. By 1939, the Kyle Kretzer gang had risen to the FBI's number 4 most wanted, and they were after them in all shapes and sizes you can imagine. Finally, January 24th, 1940, Kretzer was arrested, and along with his friend Arnold Kyle, and they were sentenced to 25 years in prison at McNeil's Island Federal Prison. However, he and Kyle hijacked a prison transport unit in an attempt to escape. However, they were then recaptured a few days later. So he had already attempted to escape from McNeil's Island with his partner in crime. August 22nd, 1940, the two of them were awaiting a resentencing and a retrial because of that breakout attempt at a U.S. courthouse. U.S. Marshal James Chitty entered the cell to basically take them back into the courtroom, and they jumped him. During the fight, Kretzer slammed him several times hard into the wall. More guards got there. They were subdued and put back into the holding cell. Chitty himself walked in to talk to the judge because the judge wanted to know if he was all right. And during that briefing with the judge, he became dizzy, started hallucinating, and literally hit the floor. He died a few days later from his injuries. So then you had both Kretzer, who was the one that basically slammed him up against the wall several times, was sentenced to life for murder, sent to Alcatraz in August 1940. Kyle was also sent to Alcatraz with an extended sentence onto their brothel and robbery sentence, and they were both incarcerated together at Alcatraz. In 1941, they were working in one of the industry sections. They attempted an escape by themselves, but were captured, and they were separated from that time on. They never really had any contact with each other. Later on, Arnold Kyle was paroled and allowed out, and after a brief stint at Leavenworth, he was sent to Alcatraz to Leavenworth Prison in Kansas, and then finally paroled. And he died of natural causes about 20 years later. Our number 3 convict from the Battle of Alcatraz was Marvin Hubbard. Born August 13th, 1912 in Boaz, Alabama. He lived about 45 minutes from where I grew up. I honestly didn't know that until doing research for this, so that was pretty interesting. Basically, Hubbard was a kidnapper. He started out with extortion and robbery. He was captured and sent to a federal pen in Atlanta. Then from where he escaped in 1942, kidnapping a Chattanooga, Tennessee police officer and taking that officer across state lines in an attempt to escape. He was recaptured a few weeks later, and in 1944, after another brief stint in Atlanta where he attempted another escape, he was sent to Alcatraz. Now, he got along very well at Alcatraz. He was imprisoned in C Block and worked in the kitchen. One thing about C Block, you'll notice that a lot of the people that work in the industry sections are imprisoned in C Block because it was the most accessible to the industry section. So he worked in the kitchen, he was a cook, and therefore he had access to a lot of things that other prisoners wouldn't have access to. Think knives, forks, anything with a pointy edge he would have access to. So keep that in mind. Number 4 is Sam Shockley. Born January 12, 1909 in Little River, Arkansas. Now, this is probably the most tragic of our 6. He was the 8th son of a family of sharecroppers, and he was often left alone with his older siblings when he was young because his parents were out working the land for the landowner. And one day, his 9-year-old sister, Myrtle, was watching them and got them too close to the fireplace. The fire leaped from the fireplace to them, caught them both on fire. Myrtle basically ran out, did the stop, drop, and roll with Sam, and then basically dropped him on the ground and left him there, and then ran off to find their parents. However, due to that trauma, both the force from being stopped, dropped, and rolled, as well as the injury on the head he received, he was never quite right after that, according to his neighbors. He was later on diagnosed with schizophrenia and depression. He was in and out of reformatories his entire life because of petty theft, and was often beaten by guards at these reformatories as well as other prisoners. So he suffered a lot of head trauma. On top of it, he was diagnosed at one of these facilities with schizophrenia. Finally, in 1938, he attempted to steal a man's car and then rob a bank, kidnapping the couple in the car, Mr. and Mrs. D.F. Penley, and they were actually employees of the bank in Paoli, Oklahoma, where he attempted this. He was captured and sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, starting out at Leavenworth. However, May 16, 1938, he was transferred to Alcatraz simply because of his mental state. He caused a lot of uproar at Leavenworth. At least once a day, he would have fits, go crazy in his cell, start throwing things, basically as far as even throwing his own excrement. I mean, literally acting like an ape. I mean, I'm not shaming anybody with schizophrenia, but untreated schizophrenia, he was absolutely ape-like in how he dealt with people. And because of that, instead of putting him in a federal hospital for the mentally insane, because at this time we still had asylums in America where he could have received the treatment he needed, they ignored that and decided Alcatraz, because of its strict routine, might be good for him. So they sent him to Alcatraz and actually imprisoned him in solitary confinement, more torture to a tortured brain, in D Block. Now, Shockley's antics continued at Alcatraz. Daily he would have the same fits. The guards learned how to deal with him, but he would often find himself going between his solitary confinement cell and the hole because of his outburst. Still, no one thought maybe we should get this guy to an asylum. Number 5, Mirren Thompson, or Edgar Thompson, December 6, 1917, born in Colorado. He spent his days robbing and kidnapping across the Southwest in Oklahoma, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico. Finally, in 1939, he shot and killed an Amarillo police detective, Mr. Lamel Dodd Savage, and he was then imprisoned for 99 years in the federal prison system, but because of bad behavior, he was transferred to Alcatraz just after World War II in October of 1945. Finally, our last, and number 6, Clarence Carnes. Clarence Carnes set a couple of records. He was known as the Choctaw Kid. He was born January 14th, 1927 in Daisy, Oklahoma. He was the oldest of 5 children to some sharecroppers and was a full-blooded Choctaw Native American. He was known as the Choctaw Kid by his family and in the federal prison system that he entered at the age of 16 because he attempted to hold up a general store and ended up accidentally shooting the attendant. He was first imprisoned in a reformatory where he attempted an escape, where he took a guard hostage. He was essentially recaptured and then sent to Leavenworth, where he again attempted an escape. They decided that if nowhere else could hold the 17-year-old at this time, then Alcatraz would. And at the age of 18, he became the youngest person. In April of 1945, became the youngest person ever incarcerated at Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary. He also set another record as the only participant in both of these attempted escapes we're going to talk about. He was an active participant in the first one. In the second one, his involvement hasn't necessarily been proven, but I think there's enough evidence to at least mention that he was part of the planning, even though he didn't actually take part in the escape attempt, but he was part of the planning. I'm going to go out on the limb and say, yes, that happened. But let's get into it. He also was very well read. He was diagnosed with psychosis, with acute psychosis, and only had an IQ of 93. So he was of average intelligence, but he was an avid reader. He had read, by the time the second escape attempt took place in the 1960s, credited as reading all 15,000 books available at the Alcatraz library. They had a 15,000 book library there where prisoners that worked there would sort books, take the orders from the prisoners, and then deliver them cell to cell. Now, one thing you have to remember about Alcatraz, they censored everything, at least in the early days. Any magazines that came out, any articles or anything like that that might incite a riot or help people build stuff like weapons, they would actually tear those pages out, the same with books. So everything they did was highly censored. They also would censor the prisoners' mail when it came in. All the mail, the handwritten letters, were retyped by guards, removing anything that the prisoner shouldn't know. They would even remove mentions of deaths in the family because that might cause a prisoner to want to escape. So, very locked down there. All right, let's get into the actual battle. It started on May 2nd, 1946. Coy, our good friend Barney Coy, as I said, he was the cell house janitor for C&D block, and he got to know the guards' routines, and they knew that supply boat came in every day between 2 and 2:30 in the afternoon. It came in around 2, left at 2:30. So their plan was to storm C&D block, get weapons from the guard cage above the cell block, and then get the key from the guards that opened the door into the exercise yard, and then the key that opened it on the other side. Basically run out with weapons, all 6 of them, and any other prisoners, because they planned to open all the cells in C&D block. And anybody that wanted to join them could also join them, and they planned to storm that boat, take over the boat, and then take it over to San Francisco Bay and disappear into the woods. So it all began about 12 p.m. on May 2nd, 1946. Coy, who had been starving himself for many weeks to get skinny enough to kind of take out his part of the thing, had determined that the guard's cage above C block, which was only divided from the outside by bars about the same length apart as jail cells, just a few inches, that he could manufacture a bar spreader, which he did using a couple of bolts and a long metal rod that he had gotten from industry, because I said he was the janitor. He had access to a lot. So he manufactured this bar spreader. And he had, like I said, starved himself, lost about 8 or 10 pounds so that he would be skinny enough to slip through. His plan was, when Hubbard came back from kitchen duty, he was often frisked by the guard, Officer William Miller, one of the guards that would end up being killed, and they would overpower the guard, knock him out, and then that would give Coy enough time to climb up to the top of the guard rack, slip through with the spreader, and then get all the weapons they would need. They had guns, pistols, rifles, tear gas, clubs, whatever they needed would be up there. So that happened. A few minutes after 12, after lunch was over, Hubbard did come back through to go into C block into his cell while Officer William Miller was frisking him. They attacked him and overcame him. They knew that they would have a brief window of opportunity because Officer Bert Birch, who was the guard in the upper tower at that time, would often leave at that time to walk into the next block to kind of watch all of the prisoners coming through for lunch go into the mess hall. So they knew his routine as well because of Coy, and they knew at that exact moment he would be gone and that Hubbard would time himself coming back when that upper guard was gone, and then they could overpower Miller. Once they took care of Miller, they did not kill him, they simply knocked him out. They released Joseph Kretzer and Clarence Carnes from their C block cells and then armed them with the stuff that Coy got from the guard tower. Now, while the others were waiting down below, they put Miller into one of the C block cells, and Coy waited for Officer Birch to return from watching the prisoners go to lunch. He climbed to the top of the bars in the tower, waited for Birch to enter through the door, dropped down on him, knocked him unconscious. Once Officer Birch was taken out, Coy, with his Springfield rifle, with a sight that was bent, unbeknownst to Coy, and this would end up becoming a huge... He went through the door into D block, which was solitary, used the automatic door operating system to open literally all the cells in D block, thus releasing Sam Shockley and Miriam Thompson, who were in lockdown. Once they were joined back in C block by Shockley and Thompson, they decided to enact the second part of their plan, which was to get the keys going from the prison to the yard, and then the yard down to the ocean. They started looking through the keys and could not find the proper. What they did not know is that Officer Miller had removed the key, even though he wasn't supposed to, and kept it on himself at all times because it would prevent him from having to go up to get the keys and then go in to let the prisoners in after lunch. It was just easier for him, so he did break protocol, and he had that in his pocket on his key ring. Now, he decided that he was going to, of course, do his best to thwart this escape attempt. So while he and Birch were in the cell in C block they had been put into, he removed that key from his key ring and dropped it down the toilet. Hey everyone, here is the layout of the interior of Alcatraz Federal Prison. As you can see, here's a typical cell layout: toilet, sink, bed, and a small desk here. And that's pretty much all prisoners had. The layout might have been a little different, but that's pretty much what they contained. All right, so let's look at where the Battle of Alcatraz actually took place. Here you have C block. So you had the lower cells, upper cells, and in behind them you had utility corridor. This is where the climax would happen and the battle would actually end, but we'll get to that. Then you have the main street here, or the main walkway in C block leading into D block, and this is where all of your maximum security prisoners lied. And then here you have the outside. Up here you have the warden's office, all that good stuff. But so what happened during this is that the guards' catwalk, where a lot of weapons were kept, with bars all around it, this is where Coy actually went up and kind of sneaked his way in and knocked out that guard after he and Mirren had already knocked out the guard down here. And that's where it actually took place. And then they would, the 9 guards that they captured, they would actually imprison them here in lower level cells. And this is where the majority of it went down. So I just wanted to kind of show you that. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. Let's get back in the cell. So Coy could not find the key, so he decided maybe one of them would open the door, so he started trying all kinds of keys in the door that led down to the yard. However, what he didn't realize is they were safety doors, and any time a false key was used more than once to open the door, they would lock down and would not open. So at this point, the escape attempt is thwarted. There is no way for them to get through the door and get down to the boat. So by this time, the guards at Alcatraz had noticed that routine was broken, that no one was answering the calls that came in from the warden's office every 15 minutes to every guard post. And because of that, they started sending other guards to check on people. And over the next few minutes, the prisoners took 9 other guards prisoner and also put them in a cell in C block. So you had 2 cells full of guards. Finally, the assistant warden decided to alert the warden, and a full-scale investigation started. And of course, by this time, the prisoners knew they had not only missed the boat, but that the guards would be there with a full battalion to kind of take them out. So at this point, they decided it's every man for himself. If you want the 3 ringleaders, Kretschner, Coy, and Hubbard, decided they were going to go out shooting. They were going to leave Alcatraz today, even if it was in a body bag. So they decided they were going to do their best to shoot their way out. The other 3 weren't Shockley, Thompson, and Carnes were not so up on dying, so there was some discussion there. And finally, they decided they could go back to their cells and hopefully not get reported for being part of the escape attempt and therefore not have any punishment, while the other 3 attempted to shoot their way out. And to make sure that Shockley, Thompson, and Carnes were not fingered for being a part of the escape, it was decided that Kretschner would shoot all the guards that were in the cells, the witnesses, which he did. Now, according to testimony later on from the guards, Carnes actually argued against this and said, let's not add murder, let's just take our punishment, let's not add murder, all they'll do is add a few years to our sentence. I'm here for life anyway, most of us are, it doesn't really matter. But Shockley wanted revenge on some of the guards for what he considered ill treatment, and they shot all of the guards, killing William Miller. The others were only wounded. So Shockley, Thompson went back to their cells. Kretschner gave Carnes a knife and told him to go in and finish off the guards. Carnes said he would, and they ran off. The 3 ringleaders ran off to face their fate. While there, Carnes could not bring himself to hurt the prisoners. He told them that he would not, and he actually gave Miller a sheet to kind of stench the flow of blood. However, Miller would die later on from his injuries. So Carnes went back to his cell, leaving all the guards alive at that moment. The guards then took that moment to write all 6 prisoner names on the wall and draw a circle around the ringleaders so that even if they did die at some point, they would know, their comrades would know who was involved. So by this time, it was 2:35 in the afternoon on May 2nd. The boat had already long since left, and it was at this time Kretschner, Hubbard, and Coy decided to make themselves known, and they started taking pot shots at some of the prison watchtower guards. Now, because of the bent sights on some of the weapons, no one was hit, but it was enough to alert the warden where they were. And Associate Warden Ed Miller, not to be confused with guard William Miller, decided to come over himself and investigate. He walked in carrying a tear gas billy club, which is a nightstick with a tear gas attachment. He came in, he was greeted by Hubbard in a guard's uniform, who pointed a weapon at him. He immediately threw the tear gas, causing it to actually explode in his face before he actually got rid of it, and ran back to the guard area. And Warden James Johnston sounded the alarm at that time. By that time, the entire prison knew what was going on. And at 6 o'clock that evening, he sent a squad of armed guards into C Block to try to rescue the guards that were being held captive there, and hopefully actually round up those that were involved. When the guards entered C Block, Coy took pot shots at them and actually killed guard Howard Steets during the ruckus. They also called in 2 platoons from the Marines stationed at the Presidio across the bay, them to guard the other cell blocks so that no one else could get involved. Finally, they were able by 7 o'clock that evening to get some guards into C block to rescue the guards that were imprisoned in C block. And then they started, once those guards were out, they started putting guns and Tommy guns and regular shotguns through the guard holes in the wall in C and D block and literally just started firing. So there was a barrage of bullets going on. It was this time Birdman Stroud, who, as you remember, was in D block, actually called out to the warden, telling him that no one was in D block, please stop firing. They believed Stroud because Stroud gave them no trouble. He simply sat in his cell and read about. We'll do another story on him later. By the 3rd of May, the warden had about had it, so he asked the Marine commanders if they would. The Marines were commanded by General Joe Stilwell and Frank Merrill to help them out. So the Marines took up residence on top of the prison and started dropping grenades into the prison using string in D block and C block, kind of exploding them, trying to force the 3 armed convicts out. And eventually they took up residence in the utility corridor behind, all the time gunfire and grenades going off around them. The next day, the final day, May 4th, at approximately 9:40 in the morning Pacific Standard Time, an attachment of guards entered C block and entered the corridor where they thought the 3 prisoners were and found all 3 of their bodies.
With the 3 ringleaders dead in their foxhole, Federal Prison Director Bennett and Warden Johnston, wearing glasses, count the cost. In addition to the dead convicts, 2 prison guards lost their lives. 15 wounded men completed the casualty list, Assistant Warden Edward Miller being one. 3 other convicts may pay the death penalty for their part in the grim Battle of the Rock.
Now, to this day, they don't know if they killed themselves or they were hit by the shrapnel that was bouncing around. Could have been either, but they were all pretty cut up. Once they dealt with their bodies, sent their bodies to the morgue, they took Carnes, Shockley, and Thompson, whose names were identified by the writing on the guard's wall, and threw them in the hole. The next of kin of the 3 dead convicts were notified. Only Edna Kretschner, remember Edna? The sister of Kretschner's co-runner of the gang that he was married to, actually came to collect his body. But because she was also wanted, she actually told them she was his sister and gave a false name. However, they weren't fooled, and they ended up taking her into custody when they found out she had warrants. So there's another little interesting tidbit. I couldn't find any information on who actually claimed the other 2. I doubt they were claimed at all. They were probably buried in a pauper's grave. So Marion Thompson, Sam Shockley, Clarence Carnes were tried later in 1947 for their part in it and were sentenced to death for Marion Thompson and Sam Shockley. Clarence Carnes was remanded with an additional life sentence. He already had 1. I don't understand the purpose of that, but was remanded back to Alcatraz because of because he attempted to save the guards' lives, and that came out in the testimony, and because of his age. As you said, he was only 18. And he would go on to live to take part, at least in the planning process, of the next attempt we'll talk about. But Thompson and Shockley were executed at San Quentin Prison December 3rd, 1948, for the murder of the guards during that attempted escape. Now, because of the damage to the corridor the 3 convicts were hiding in, the shots damaged the concrete, the grenades damaged the concrete, the pipes were damaged, and there was a lot of water damage behind those corridors, which were only partially fixed. The pipes were fixed, it was kind of dried out, and they put a fresh coat of paint on it. And that would lead to our next escape attempt, which most people believe was actually successful, that occurred in 1962. And that's what we'll talk about next time. I hope you enjoyed this. I did. If you want to support the channel, links are down below. Always like, share, comment, subscribe. Thanks a lot, guys. Until next time, Keto Comic.